Let's take a look at some custom cards for Battlegrounds. I asked you guys to make some elemental themed Battlegrounds cards, and we got 10 really, really cool ones for this video, starting off with Frosteron from GeoLibra. It would be a tier 5 elemental, a 4/5, and the effect is really cool. At the end of each turn, this gets +1/+1 for each frozen minion in Bob's Tavern. So you've got here a late game scale style card that's going to get much bigger. Think about things like Garr as a potential comparison, but only if you're freezing your shop is this going to get bigger. And it's only going to scale a lot if you have a higher tier shop. So for instance, if you're still on tier 4 and you triple into this guy, you might only be freezing the 5 minions instead of the full 6 that you'd get from going to tier 6. So he's only going to gain +5/+5 per turn. If you somehow, get him even sooner off Shifter's Eris, of course, could scale even lower, but on average, you'd expect at least 5/5, sometimes 6/6 per turn. Now, that said, of course, if you buy something in the shop and then freeze it so you end on a buy, he could scale a little bit less on any given turn. And also noteworthy is the fact that that kind of costs you a gold, right? Because you essentially, if you didn't want to freeze anything anyway and you're freezing just for the buff, then you don't get that automatic refresh reroll at the start of your next shop phase. So it's kind of like you're spending 1 gold here for a 5/5 or 6/6 buff in many cases. So you could argue that this scales a little bit less reliably than something like Garr, but keep in mind, this doesn't actually need elemental synergies or anything. This could be a standalone minion. It works on any given sort of board. As long as you're able to freeze, you could toss this into a Lightfang Enforcer Menagerie build, and it would be an awesome card to scale with alongside your Bran or whatever Lightfang Menagerie stuff you're trying to do. So I love that it has that flexibility. Plus, we don't know what elementals would look like in Battlegrounds if they had some other way to extract these stats or duplicate them or multiply them in some fashion or another, or they really rewarded freezing stuff on board. You could imagine some additional synergies coming in for Frosteron as well. But I like how this takes a core Battlegrounds mechanic, it ties it in from a flavor name standpoint as an elemental ice guy, and connects that together as a pretty nifty card that I think would be really, really good, particularly in Menagerie builds. Moving on, it's Ragnaros World's End from Cameron Cardoza. There's actually going to be a few different Ragnari in this video. A tier 6 elemental, he's an 8/8, and in Start of Combat, deal 8 damage per friendly elemental to random enemy minions. So here we have a take on elemental synergies, which is from having them on board, you get a nice little bonus. So if you had 6 elementals beyond Ragnaros, that'd be a total of 7. It doesn't say other friendly enemy minions, so you'd be dealing 8 damage 7 different times. So much like you've got your little whelp for dragons that's sending off some pings at the start of a fight, Ragnaros is going to send off some pings too, but instead of an early setup minion, this is a big follow-up minion that's going to deal up to 56 damage, and you presume if you somehow goldened this at tier 6, not impossible, that it would be dealing something like 16 damage per friendly elemental minion, which is a lot of damage. Now, he is just an 8/8 at a base, so he's not going to be doing a lot on board himself necessarily, unless you triple into him really early or something. But if you can get this as that centerpiece cap to an elemental build, this is going to pop off Divine Shield, snipe Soul Jugglers, deal with all kinds of crazy stuff before it even gets to attack. Maybe you end up killing their cleave minion if you get lucky. So this does offer a great finishing tool. And instead of like Soul Jugglers, which do risk, being killed before they're ever able to actually activate their pings, this goes off right at start of combat. So it's a guaranteed effect as well. All of which I think you need if this is going to be a tier 6 minion. So I really like the idea here of this super Ragnaros that's ending the world. That's pretty amazing. Great artwork choice. And of course, a character everybody would want to see in Battlegrounds. Moving on to Element of Surprise. I'm pretty sure I chose this one just because the name is so good. It's from Bastonator, tier 3 elemental. It's a 4/2 with Divine Shield, and at start of combat, it attacks the rightmost minion. So of course in Battlegrounds, in many cases, people are putting that build around thing at the far right because they want to protect it forever. That could be your Baron Rivendare, your Mama Bear. For tokens, it could be your Soul Juggler like we talked about. And this is a way to snipe that minion, particularly looking really good against Mama Bear or Soul Juggler with some buffs, maybe against that Baron. And that's cool. And the cool thing is, of course, your opponent can pretty easily, in many cases, play around this. They can often just put that taunt minion at the far right. If the late game scenario sets up, that usually happens anyway. That kind of denies this. It's really in the mid game where I think this would thrive, when you catch them off guard, when they're not really expecting you to have this yet, or you play it specifically just to tech against that guy because you know he's demons and that Soul Juggler is going to be there. which fits the name. It's the element of surprise. It's really only good, I think, when it is indeed surprising, and particularly through a limited range throughout the course of the game. But cards like this really do help shake up Battlegrounds. They add strategic elements. And that's exactly why I'd love to see this one. Moving on to Lieutenant Garr here, character I love from the old Molten Core raid days. He's a tier 5 from Magic Milk, a 5/1 at his base with Taunt, but his battle cry here is crazy. Gain +2 health for each elemental you bought this game. So you could imagine this being much like in an Island Battlemaster, a giant, 540, 550 or something if you just cycle elementals like crazy. And in fact, you could expect elemental builds, I think, to do that. Like, playing from hand, having cards in hand, cycling through a bunch of stuff. That could be one way we see elementals implemented into Battlegrounds. So Lieutenant Garr, who knows? Maybe you're cycling a bunch of like little token elementals over and over again, and this is gaining that 40, 50, 60 health because you've been able to play so many throughout the course of the game. I kind of tried to map out how many on average I think you'd play. You're only buying 3 or 4 things per turn, even if you're playing this on like turn 10. It's going to be hard to have played more than like 20 elementals. So I don't think this is going to be big on its first hit, but certainly as you triple it, golden it, get to the late game stages, one of these could be an enormous card that really helps you build a nice defensive wall. Next up here is Sparkfire Elemental, tier 4 from Luna, 0/4. At the end of your turn, gain +2/+2 for every elemental you have in your hand. And I think this is a really interesting twist. Because essentially, right now, we don't keep a lot of cards in hand generally in Battlegrounds. You might occasionally have a Shifter Xeris or a Banana. Sometimes in the super late game, if you're doing like brand shenanigans and tripling like crazy, you might end up with some Murlocs and some stuff left over in your hand from Murazons and Pirates. There's very, very rare scenarios where you have a lot of cards in hand. So what if we had a mechanic that actually rewarded that in some way? And what if Elementals played to that fact, where they were all about stuff in your hand as opposed to actions on board instead? Now, of course, not every card in this video is going to be synergistic, so this wouldn't have any support based on what we've seen in this video so far, but you could easily establish and expect a mechanic where having stuff in hand would benefit a lot. And if you keep 10 cards in hand, this thing's going to scale like absolutely crazy, but maybe it's more realistic to have 3-4 cards in hand, and this still scales at a pretty reasonable rate for a tier 4 minion. Or maybe there's not a mechanic to support that, and this is just an alternate direction for a hero like Mukla that maybe wants to keep bananas in hand, or some other hero that gets a similar mechanic, or maybe you just keep 1 or 2 things in hand to make sure you can play off a Sparkfire Elemental from time to time. All of those seem like pretty cool opportunities for Battlegrounds to move in a slightly new direction, and a card like this would enable that in a pretty fun way. Moving on to Gripping Frost here from Hiasetsu, a tier 2 elemental. It's a 2/3. Battlecry, freeze a minion in Bob's Tavern and give it +1/+1. So we have here essentially the Syndragosa hero power, but on a stick attached to a minion. And here another way to play off of frozen cards and frozen synergy stuff, which I think is, again, a really cool idea. Taking one of the core mechanics of Battlegrounds and connecting it to one of the minion types makes a lot of sense to me. If elementals encourage battle cries at all or playing multiple things, this would be another cheap way to cycle, get a freeze on a targeted thing, get that extra reroll essentially at the start of your next turn while still keeping the one thing you care about frozen. That's a neat implication. So you could use it to buff, you could use it for economy, you could use it to freeze targeted things, play for triples, cycle. It does a lot of different things really well, making it a very high utility 2-drop that's still very fair from a stat standpoint, so it's not going to like overwhelm early boards, which is awesome. I think that's a really well designed and a fun mechanic for a card. Moving on to Ragnaros, firelord this time from Shardclaw. Another tier 6 Ragnaros here. And it's an 8/8, of course. Start of combat, deal damage to all enemy minions equal to the number of elementals you last played in Bob's Tavern. So if we are envisioning a world where it's all about playing elementals from hand and cycling elementals onto the board, with token stuff, whatever it might be, this would be a great centerpiece around that sort of build where, you've got Bran and you're cycling Battlecry elementals. You got the Ragnaros that's now going to deal extra damage to everything based on the number you played. If you play just 2 or 3, this isn't that exciting. It's not that different than like a Nefarian hero power, a little extra. But in the late game, of course, just dealing 2 to everything often doesn't add up in meaningful ways other than removing Divine Shields. Specifically, beyond that, probably has pretty low impact. Now, of course, Divine Shield removal is great. That's awesome. That may be worth it in and of itself. But there could also be scenarios where if you play like 10 elementals in a turn because you've got a card that like adds an elemental to hand, and that's like 2, and then you play that a couple times. You've got other cycle cards. If you got to deal 10 damage to everything on board, suddenly you're dealing with like, your opponent's Baron Rivendare is dead. That's amazing. So you could set up some scenarios where you very specifically like store things in hand or try to build specific, I need to get to 10 this turn to answer that thing I know that they have. Or maybe I don't care that much and I just need 1 for Divine Shields for Ragnaros to be worth it. But, if you get to 5, this is a 35 damage total ping. Maybe the numbers add up in some significant ways. You get this early enough in the game, you might be able to wipe out entire boards, which is a little scary, but I think it would be hard to play that many elementals and that early as a tier 6 minion. So very nicely balanced at tier 6 here, and a great way to reward that cycling style of play. And of course, taking this Fellfire Ragnaros we saw teased and the Fellfire stuff and putting him into the game in a permanent way is absolutely awesome. Now let's take a look here at the gold elemental from Fwifo Force, a tier 3 elemental to 4/4, and it reads, if you bought an elemental last turn, this card costs 0. So pretty cool economy manipulation style card here, but only if you're regularly cycling into elementals. You can basically use this to dump an elemental, maybe activate some trigger or another, like many of the cards we've seen being played elementals from hand. This card would support that nicely because it's a net gain of 1 gold. You buy it for 0, you sell it for 1. That's awesome. It helps fuel future elementals. You get off multiples of these in a turn. You could go absolutely crazy fueling some of these other cards that we've seen. That would be cool. Not to mention anybody who's buying an elemental in a pinch could just use this as a 1 gold gain. You buy it for 0, you sell it for 1. Even if you're not an elemental build, if you dropped 1 randomly, or you just buy one of these every single turn, you can start funneling a lot of extra gold into your coffers, which gets you that extra reroll here and there. So a card that has both general utility in specific scenarios, and a card that also could fuel some Battlegrounds elemental synergy stuff. Both of those are amazing. So a card like this is a very, very intriguing design. Next up is Ahun, the Frostlord from Regis is my dad. That's right. Never forget it. It's a tier 4, 4/8 elemental. Pretty meaty body there. Start of combat, if you played an elemental last turn, freeze 3 random enemy minions. So if you elemental cycle, you get to take advantage of some potential freezes. And of course, freezing stuff in Battlegrounds doesn't deny its ability to interact because it's still there on defense. You still have to trade into it. Those stats still matter, but there are clearly a lot of different effects in Battlegrounds which are attack-based. So you've got stuff like the pirates that are getting buffs on attacks. You've got cleave effects. So freezing out your opponent's big cave hydra could be awesome. Maybe they've got a death rattle minion they're trying to get off early, like Spawning is off. This can freeze it out, preventing that buff from going off, buying you maybe a few extra sneaky attacks in the meantime before they do the thing they want to do. So clearly freezes would have a really big impact. That said, this is not a card that would inherently scale super well on its own. It's only a 4/8, it's not getting any bigger. So you need to make sure those are impactful freezes and you're still doing other things with your board in the meantime. So this might be something you just kind of toss in a pinch as the final piece of any given board when you're cycling other battle cries and such. On targeted boards, they've got the Goldrin, they've got the Cave Hydra. I need to freeze those specifically to try to win as a kind of tech answer card. I think that's really cool and also just encourages you to keep that elemental chain flowing, both of which seem to fit a potential elemental game plan really nicely. And there you go. That wraps it up for our look at potential elementals in Battlegrounds. A lot of people played on this idea of cycling elementals, which is really cool because it's familiar to what we have in standard last turn style effects, chaining elementals together. That feels like a really good flavor, and it might work really nicely in Battlegrounds too. So I wouldn't be shocked at all if we saw designs reminiscent of these when we eventually get elementals in Battlegrounds. Assuming we do, we only have 2 minion types left with totems and elementals, so it seems destined to be that elementals will eventually arrive. So I hope we do see some designs like these, some pretty sick cards in this one. That said, we're going to have you guys tackle the final minion type that has not appeared in Battlegrounds yet for our next custom card submissions. That is totems. I want you to design some custom totems. Try to envision what mechanics might look like for totems. Of course, you're just maybe making 1 card, but you could still hint at and encourage the sort of ideas totems might play off of. Maybe it's a bunch of death rattles. Maybe it's randomness. Maybe it's gold efficiency. Maybe it's something happens and you sell them. I don't know, but come up with some cool ideas and some neat totems that would fit really nicely into Battlegrounds. Make them big, make them small. I like to see it all, and that was an awesome rhyme. There are details in the description below for submitting those custom cards for next time. These videos, of course, take a while to come out, so don't expect it anytime soon, but eventually we'll take a closer look at your totem designs. That said, share your thoughts on these cards in the comments below. thanks so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.